our fireside tonight on July 5th, 2020. We are here to welcome all of you, and it's so nice to see your faces. There are so many of you joining us tonight. We're very happy and proud to have you and Dr. Albert Lincoln presenting us our fireside tonight. For your information, this fireside will be available on the website www.firesidebaha'i.org. And there on that site, you will find many other firesides ready for your use. You can look at them, show your friends, send them to your Baha'i and non-Baha'i friends for use as you see fit. So tonight we have Dr. Lincoln, as you know. We're very lucky to have him, and I would like to read to you a little bit of his history, as well as let you know the subject for tonight, which is how did the Baha'i Faith become a world religion? Dr. Albert Lincoln, as Secretary General of the Baha'i International Community, served from 1994 to 2013. He represented the elected international governing body of the Baha'i Faith in international forums and interactions with heads of state and government, diplomats, high officials, and leaders of thought from many parts of the world. Based in the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel, he was also responsible for the management of its host country relations, including dealings with national and municipal authorities, Jewish and Arab community leaders, and organizations of civil society. He received an honorary doctorate conferred by the University of Haifa in 2010 and an award of merit from the city of Haifa in 2013. Before moving to the Holy Land, Dr. Lincoln practiced law for 23 years in France and Africa, serving international institutions, embassies, and multinational corporations, as well as local businesses and individuals of many nationalities. His litigation experience included the defense of political and religious dissidents, as well as former officials put on public trial following a change of regime. Dr. Lincoln retired in December 2013 and is presently an active member of the Baha'i community of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He is married to Joan Lincoln, and they have 3 grown children and 7 grandchildren. So thank you again for joining us, Dr. Lincoln. We welcome you, and please start your presentation. Thank you.
Homa, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, friends, and I hope that you find the presentation interesting. The process by which the Baha'i Faith evolved from a little-known oriental religious movement, generally assumed to be a sub-sect of Shia Islam, into a meaningful world religion is a remarkable story. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my slides. Of course, there are several definitions, at least 2 definitions of what's a world religion. One is by content, and one, of course, is by demographics and actual world spread. So from the beginning, the faith taught by the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh was an independent world religion by its content and self-definition. But to achieve this status in objective demographic terms, it had to spread around the world and take root in diverse cultures while navigating a highly turbulent period of world history. 1844 to 1994 is the period we're going to cover, which was marked by 2 world wars, the Great Depression, innumerable regional conflicts, and major shifts in political alignments within and between nations. Now, I want to say that this presentation is an amateur presentation. I am not a historian or a scholar generally, and neither am I, a endless bank of detailed information about the history of the Baha'i Faith. what I found was missing in the presentations that are there is this sort of overview, the big picture. There's innumerable books have been published about particular stories and details of this country and this person and that family and so on. But I couldn't find something that would give the sweep and the overall picture of how this came about. So I set about gathering the information and using only published sources. None of it comes from sort of insider materials, but putting together the pieces from here and there and trying to get that big picture. It's also amateur in the sense that I am not, the visuals are not very sophisticated. I'm not anywhere near as good as my grandchildren in PowerPoint. But I think, and I'll explain some of the simplifications as we go ahead. But again, the idea is to convey this overall picture, and I hope that for that purpose it succeeds. So at the beginning, let's start at the beginning, the way this worldwide spread was accomplished, despite many challenges and setbacks that we'll talk about later, highlights a number of unique characteristics of the movement, including its organic flexibility and resilience. Now, seen in a rearview mirror, looking backwards, past achievements often look like as if they were a foregone conclusion. Well, of course, it had to happen that way because it did. Well, I'm going to ask you not to fall into that trap, but to try to, and not to take for advantage, not to take for granted these outcomes. So kindly take a step back in time and imagine if you were the first person in the world to discover the Baha'i teachings. And in your enthusiasm, you were determined to spread them around the globe. How would you go about it? What would be your strategy? Now, as you consider the situation, you would find that you have some very serious obstacles. The first one is, well, okay, the message is very attractive, but we know, everybody knows that people naturally resist change. And power structures feel threatened and react oppressively often. And these obstacles, in this case, have to be overcome without recourse to many of the tools that historically have been used to bring about major social change. I'm thinking of violence, material incentives, political manipulations, media tricks, superstar charisma. They've all been tried and used, but they're all forbidden by the very nature of the Baha'i teachings. Now, the second challenge is how to reach the whole world, the world's entire population, without being appropriated or taken over by one nation or culture, or even worse, becoming an instrument to be used or an object to be fought over in their endless squabbles. Now, the natural instinct of a minority is often to cling together for safety and comfort, to create larger groups, pull the wagons in a circle, and protect yourself. But that would be counterproductive given that challenge. So here, there was a need to avoid those problems. There was a need to disperse around the world, essentially under the radar, without creating large groups and large clusters of population that would attract attention and become the subject of political manipulations by the powers that be. So in considering this process, I created some stages and given them names that made sense to me. The very first stage, I've called it Revelation and Repression. And this is the period of the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh. It covers 48 years from 1844 to 1892. Then the next period I've called the Breakout. And that's really the period of Abdu'l-Bahá. And I chose the name Breakout because there were a number of religious movements in the 19th century. there was Adventism within Christianity and Mormonism also. Within Judaism, Hasidism. Within Islam, the Ahmadiyya movement. In other words, it was a very important period in terms of religious development, and a lot of things were going on. But all of those movements that I've named essentially remained within the religious framework, or at least the cultural framework in which they were born. Mormons may not consider themselves Christians, but they're still culturally very Western and very, very Christian. Hasidism is definitely still Jewish. The Ahmadiyya consider themselves the true Muslims. And Adventism, of course, is still very much, or even as it evolved within Christianity, remained Christian. And so what's significant here is that relatively early in its history, the Baha'i Faith broke out of its original cultural and religious matrix. It was moved beyond the Middle East, moved into the West, started to have followers who are Westerners or people from different cultures and backgrounds, and so that it was no longer this Middle Eastern sect that was considered as part of Islam. It was clearly established its independence. So that's a very important period in the development. The next stage is reaching the farthest corners of the earth, and this is the dispersion, and no longer as a result of repression directly, but much of it voluntarily and planned. And we'll talk about that. And then the fourth period is putting flesh on the bones, where we start to see significant numbers, a major increase in the size of the Baha'i community, and also the development of national communities and really growing out of the grassroots and the basis in different countries around the world. So starting with the first stage, this map shows the exiles of Baha'u'lláh. There were, in Iran from the beginning in 1844, there were large numbers of adherents, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, mostly Muslims, then quite a number of Jews and Zoroastrians, and a trickle of Christians. And the repression and violent reaction of the authorities in Iran led to Baha'u'llah's banishment, and it was in stages. First, he was for 10 years in Baghdad, and then 5 years in Turkey between Istanbul and Edirne, and then the last 24 years of his life in the Holy Land. In the area of Haifa, Akka, and the Galilee. Now, in addition to these exiles, which are part of the repression, there's something else was happening. If you can see my cursor, I'm pointing out the northern border of Iran with Russian Turkmenistan. And because of the repression of the Baha'is and the Babis within Iran, hundreds initially, and then eventually thousands of Iranian Baha'is crossed over that border and established a community in the city of Ashgabat in Russian Turkmenistan. So when you actually look at the situation at the end of this period, the spread of the faith is basically limited within the Middle East. It's about 15 countries by modern borders. And here I have to explain that I was not able to find maps with national borders that went with the dates. So I used what's available or what I found, which was modern borders. So it looks like 15 countries. At the time, however, they were all part of essentially 4 empires. The Ottoman Empire, which was the largest one, and the Iran was also a Persia, Iran, an empire, and then those two very Middle Eastern states. Then, with the exceptions of the Russian Empire, which was that colony or community in Ashgabat, and the British Empire, which is essentially India, Burma, Egypt, and Sudan. So let me, and I want to tell you a little bit about these, particularly about India. There, some of the relatives of the Báb had started the businesses in Mumbai, then Bombay, in the 1850s. In 1875, Baha'u'lláh actually sent one of the believers named Jamal Effendi, I think that's him on the right, to travel teaching to India and Burma. Mustafa Rumi, the gentleman over here, I think he was taught by Jamal Effendi and enrolled in Calcutta in 1878. He then traveled and settled to Rangoon, taught in Mandalay, which is then in Burma, Myanmar today, where the Baha'i community actually created the casket in which the Báb is buried. And there was an entire village called Daidanau that converted to the Bahá'í Faith in that period. In Russia, I mentioned about this community in Ashgabat, but it also spread through Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan. And by the end of the century, by 1890, there were already 1,000 Baha'is just in the city of Ashgabat. So at this stage, as you saw from the map, we're still talking about the Middle East and Near East, India, and Turkmenistan. There was no notice taken of the Baha'i Faith in the West, in Europe. Professor Edward Granville Brown was very much interested in the phenomena, actually traveled to the Holy Land and met Baha'u'lláh on several occasions and recorded his impressions. There was a French diplomat, A.L.M. Nicolas, who was writing about the Baha'i Faith. Tolstoy corresponded with Baha'is and showed great interest. There were German Templars who had settled in Haifa, who were in contact with the Baha'is and wrote about them in their newspaper. But as far as we know, at this time there was not a single Baha'i believer in any of the Western countries, which is why we now go to the next stage. And what's important to note here is that Ottoman, Baha'u'lláh lived the rest of his life in what was then Ottoman Palestine, today Israel. His son Abu Baha was also there, and this was an interesting period when the contacts between the Eastern Mediterranean, Palestine, and Europe were developing rapidly. This is a map of steamship routes, and steamships were plying the whole Mediterranean in and out of between Italy and Egypt and Marseille, and even into the Atlantic and back and forth to Haifa and various parts of Lebanon and Cyprus and so on. And this was having an impact on the society in Palestine. A number of the local notables traveled to Europe. They had their children educated in Europe. They bought things, furniture for their homes in Europe. And so it was becoming really sort of a bridge between the East and the West, which was very helpful then for this breakout, of which I'm mentioning. And in terms of time, Abdul Baha was still a prisoner of the Turkish government until the 1908 Young Turk revolt, followed by some reforms and the release of all the non-criminal prisoners, all the religious and political prisoners. So that 1908 suddenly made it possible for Abdul Baha to travel and opened a 6-year window between 1908 and 1914 when the First World War began and the Middle East was affected by that war. And so it was really just a window of opportunity of 6 years. And it's quite remarkable really what transpired in that period. So, and what I'm talking about mainly about the spread to the West. Now the story is quite a remarkable story. It centers on two gentlemen called Khairullah and Haddad. They were Lebanese. They belonged to a Christian sect called the Maronites, and they left their home in Lebanon and went to Egypt in 1890. Encountered some Persian Baha'is there who taught them about the Baha'i Faith, and they enrolled and declared themselves as Baha'is. The problem is that they only understood part of the story because they spoke Arabic, and the people who were teaching them spoke Persian. There's enough overlap so that they got some idea, but I think they missed perhaps some of the subtleties. However, they were enterprising fellows, and they moved on to the United States, where they had arrived near Chicago in 1892. Now, it just so happens that in 1893, there was the first Parliament of World Religions at the World Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And at that event, a letter was read, written by, a paper written by a Christian missionary in the Middle East who talked about the passing of Baha'u'lláh 1 year earlier and quoted from the writings of Edward Granville Brown describing his encounter with Baha'u'lláh. Now, some of the people who later became Baha'is, the Americans, were actually in the audience at that time. And Khairullah and Haddad were also present in the city and knew about this and started up some classes to teach about the Baha'i Faith. Now, they made it all quite exotic and interesting, and people were very interested in it. And in fact, the response was very, very positive. And within just a few years, there were over 1,000 people who consider themselves Baha'is in the United States and Canada. So much so that one of the early Baha'is was a wealthy lady named Phoebe Hearst, part of the Hearst newspaper empire. And she decided to organize a pilgrimage, a group pilgrimage, to go and visit Abdul Baha in the Holy Land. Now, remember, this is 1898. He's still a prisoner, but she decided that they would take this group to visit. Now, in this picture, I've forgotten now who all the ladies are, but this is Mr. Khairullah in the middle. He considers himself a very important gentleman sitting there. And this girl up here is Robert Turner, and he probably didn't consider himself very important because he was Mrs. Phoebe Hearst Butler. But Baha'is consider him important because he was the first African American to become a Baha'i as a result of this pilgrimage, and he was very much favored by Abdul Baha when they were in the Holy Land. Abdul Baha was very, very fond of him and showed him great courtesy and respect. Now, there's another interesting dimension of this, this stage, which is the American colony in Paris. At that time, the turn of the century, there are quite a number of Americans living in Paris, artists who were studying art, but other people studying also in universities. Among the people there were May Bowles was there. Later she became May Maxwell. Her future husband, William Maxwell, was there studying architecture along with Mason Remy. Thomas Breakout was in Paris. He was English rather than American, but still he was there. Laura Barney and Hippolyte Dreyfus, later her husband. They were all part of this social circle in Paris. And the May Bowles actually joined the pilgrimage with Mrs. Hurst and the others, and became a Baha'i, and then taught there. And from there, the Baha'i Faith spread also to the United Kingdom and to Switzerland. The next stage then is this opening of the window of opportunity. Abdu'l-Baha was freed in 1908. He started making preparations for traveling to the West, and actually it was finally possible in 1911. And you see him here under the Eiffel Tower in Paris. He made several visits to Paris and stayed there quite a long time. The other picture is him giving a talk in a church in Chicago. So he was actually on these Western travels from 1911 to 1913, and just really got back to the Holy Land in time for just ahead of the outbreak of the First World War. Now, even though he could not move anymore and really couldn't do very much during the war because of the combat around, Abdu'l-Baha was far from idle. During this time, he kept up a regular correspondence with the believers in the West when he could, and he prepared some documents called the Tablets of the Divine Plan, which were essentially an appeal to the North American believers to spread the Baha'i Faith all around the world. These tablets, so-called, were written on postcards. And you see the picture on the left is one of these postcards. Even they came along with English translations, which were also on postcards. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that he chose to put them on postcards because there was censorship. And he figured the best way to get through the censor was to be totally transparent. In these tablets, Abdu'l-Baha mentions the name of 120 different countries and territories all around the world, many of them quite remote and very little known at the time. And it is understood that he may have gotten the names and the lists of these places from the school book on the right, which was used by many of the Baha'i young people who were studying in schools and colleges in Lebanon. And they probably, brought the books back on vacation to Haifa. And Abdu'l-Baha had he didn't have internet in those days, but he had this as a source to actually look for these places all around the world, and to list them, give their names, and to make this appeal that Baha'i should go to all of these places. So during this period, there are a number of things that were that came up about, in addition to writing his tablets, Abdu'l-Baha was very active in his correspondence. A number of people were moving around the world, some of them apparently on their own initiative, others by his suggestion. An American was appointed U.S. consul in Cork in Ireland in 1906. Tunisia was opened around 1910, probably by Baha'is from Egypt. We're not very sure, but that's likely. New Zealand has a very interesting story. I'll tell you a little more about her in a minute. But basically, she had a friend in England who sent her clippings about Abdu'l-Baha's appearances in London, and she became Baha'i over time. And Japan was opened by an American who moved from the U.S. China by a Chinese gentleman who enrolled in the U.S. and then returned. Martha Root started some journeys with visits to South America. In Australia, two people, John and Clara Hyde Dunn, arrived in Sydney in April 1920. And by the way, until very recently, everyone believed that they were the first Baha'is in Australasia until we discovered about Margaret Stevenson, and actually had herself become a Baha'i 7 years earlier. A lady named Fanny Knobloch settled in Cape Town, South Africa, and another one called Leonora Armstrong went to Brazil in 1921. Well, this is that first Baha'i of New Zealand. And as I mentioned before, she was just sitting there in New Zealand, and someone, her friend from England, sent her these clippings. And a little while later, an actress was visiting New Zealand to put on plays and so on. She wasn't even a Baha'i, but she knew something about it, and they got talking. And Margaret Stevenson decided she was a Baha'i and wrote to the Holy Land and even sent some small contribution that clearly indicated that she was a Baha'i. And I mentioned also about the case of this Baha'i who was a consul in court. All over the world, there's examples of these sort of odd incidents that resulted in the faith being spread around. Now, Abdu'l-Baha in the meantime was following up with both the community in Ashgabat in Russian Turkmenistan and in India. This building here was the first Baha'i house of worship anywhere in the world. The construction started in 1902, was finished in 1919. In India, the first Sikh believer enrolled in 1904, the first Hindu in 1909. There was an all India convention in 1920. Abdu'l-Baha on his way to Europe and the West visited in Egypt on several occasions. And one of the early Baha'i scholars, Mirza Abu Fazl, was teaching at the Al-Azhar Islamic University and also enrolling people there in Egypt. So that brings us to the conclusion sort of that second period. And here's what the map looks like. Now, I should say again that, when I fill in the countries, it looks as if they were full of Baha'is, and that, of course, is not the case, that there were a few, scattering of Baha'is in all of these countries. But what is significant is that 1921, which is, roughly 60 years after the beginning of the faith, it had outposts in Canada, in South America, several places in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Japan, China, India. And I sort of envisage it like staking out the corners of a tent. It isn't yet filled in, but to an extraordinary degree, already the world was sort of within the pale, and a lot of work remained to be done. But this is the result of what I call the outbreak. That this is no longer a Middle Eastern phenomenon. It is already beginning to be an international thing. And as I mentioned before, this was a unique feat in terms of religious movements of that period or any period. And the fact that the Baha'i Faith emerged from its cultural matrix so early in its history meant that Baha'is who traveled, let's say, or Baha'is who arrived in Brazil or South Africa didn't come with a huge cultural overload. Just to take, I know from our years of living in Africa that when the Christian missionaries came from Europe to Africa, they really didn't know the difference between spreading European culture and spreading Christianity. So, they told the Africans that God wants you to pray in Latin, that God doesn't like drums. So they're mixing European culture and maybe prejudice along with the teachings of Christ. And this, to a large extent, was avoided because of how early the Baha'i Faith spread around. So by the time Baha'is reached some of these places, there would be Westerners and Easterners, there would be people of different nationalities, and that allowed the Baha'i Faith to take root, and people of other cultures to say, well, if they each can do it their way, I'll do it my way, as long as the essential principles are respected. So now we move on to the next stage, which is reaching the farthest corners of the earth. There were, for a considerable period that starts in 1921 up till 1937, it was largely the continuation of these travelers, itinerant ambassadors, pioneer settlers, and what I call the wind-blown seeds. And in parallel with that, the erection of administrative framework and the start of a transition from leadership by sort of charismatic figures to institutional governance. So the next important step, though, is then has to do with South America in 1937 to 44, which, as you'll notice, corresponds largely to the period of the Second World War. And essentially, there's a message from Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, to the United States and Canada, saying the world is in turmoil. All the other Baha'i communities are paralyzed by the turmoil. You have to do something. And the only other continent that was not directly affected by the war was South America. So he said the purpose, and here from this map, you see Brazil had already been opened prior to 1921, and he asked the Baha'is from North America to settle in all the other independent countries in South America in that period of 1937 to 1944. And the only places that were essentially left were the three European colonies of the Guianas in the north. The next stage was right after the Second World War, and it essentially involved paying attention to Europe in its war-ravaged condition. The countries in light blue had previously been opened. The yellow ones here were the goals of that period. Some of them were opened before, but they had to be strengthened and so on. And then very quickly after that, in fact, while that was still going on, I launched a campaign in Africa, which was just really for 1951 to 53. Now, the blue countries had been opened prior to 1921. This is the Congo, which had been opened again by sort of a windblown seed in the 1940s, and the yellow ones were opened during that 2-year period. 1953, followed by a what was called a world crusade of 10 years. And in the very first year, over 100 countries were open to Baha'is, by Baha'is going and settling there. And by the end of that period, virtually the whole world, except for essentially the Soviet bloc, which was communism, anti-religious, and not accessible. There were still some Baha'is there from the Ishkabad community was wiped out during the Stalinist period, but there were still some Baha'is there, but they were completely in lockdown. During that period, there's some wonderful stories of heroic pioneers who picked up everything. This is Ella Bailey, who was in her 90s, and she asked to go with another family that was moving to Tripoli in Libya. And just a matter of, I think, weeks or months after arriving there, she passed away and was buried there. And Shoghi Effendi said she was the model of heroism because she got up and gave her all for the cause. The other picture here is a well-known Ugandan gentleman named Enoch Olinga. Next to him is Ali Nachavani, who was later a member of the Universal House of Justice, elected for 40 years. And the story here is that Enoch Olinga became a Baha'i in his native Uganda, and as the call was coming to settle other African countries, he agreed to go right across the continent to Cameroon. And Mr. Nachavani and his wife and several of the other friends here drove across the continent from Uganda to Cameroon, where Enoch settled and taught Cameroonians, who later pioneered to other countries in West Africa. And this was such a feat that the Guardian called Mr. Olinga the father of victories, because he not only gained a victory for himself, but he also taught other people who gained similar victories. So this 10-year plan or crusade was not just about planting flags in new territories. It had also all sorts of very detailed goals about publishing trusts and tribes to be contacted and languages to translate the Baha'i literature into, and a lot of attention to ethnic and cultural groups in the world's population, and as basis of really much of the diversity that we now have. One example of the first Baha'i of Maori descent. As you know, the Maoris are the indigenous people of New Zealand, and this gentleman, Albert Tikitu White, I think he came around in 1948, and some of you may have even met his daughter, who's a well-known artist named Robin White. So moving on to the fourth phase. So one of the first steps was to complete, this was in the 1990s, some of the last territories to be opened were Mongolia and Sakhalin Islands. Sean Hinton, I think, was the one who went to Mongolia. And then they're starting to build national communities. Now this is a graph, and I've got some others coming here showing the increase. Now this is based on only a few data points, but it has the total, and then it has 4 different geographical areas: the Islamic heartland, which is essentially the Middle East; the West, which is Western Europe and North America, and Australia and New Zealand; and then the third world. So where you see that in the beginning, of course, the numbers are very small. These are elected national bodies, which means that they're communities that have the strength and the organization to be able to elect their own governing bodies. So up till 1945, there were, I think maximum of 12 of them, and fairly equally spread in the different geographical regions. But then from that period on, you see the greatest growth is actually in the third world, so that by 1983, of the 135 national spiritual assemblies in the world, 97 of them are in the third world. The West has 25, and the Middle East only 13. Now, the other thing that happened, of course, and which made that possible, was a significant growth in the size of the Baha'i community. There's the number, the worldwide Baha'i population. Between 1963 and 1985, 22 years, the worldwide membership of the Baha'i Faith grew tenfold, from about 400,000 to over 4 million. I just mentioned quickly that these graphs, my methodology was to look at every published source I could find that had figures, and then plot all the data points and find a line that more or less covered. I mean, the statistics are not simple because people count things differently and give them different dates and different periods, and sometimes it's by continent and sometimes it's all together. But this is I'm quite confident this actually is what it looked like, in that you have this slow growth from 1844 right up to, say, 1965, and then a real inflection point. Now, if you're looking at the at the local level, you see this shift in geographic distribution is even more remarkable. I mean, I mentioned that for the whole world, it was multiplied by 10. The membership, the Baha'i membership within the United States was multiplied by about 8, but larger growth took place in countries in the third world. So the result is that if you look at the number of localities where Baha'is reside, 100,000 out of 113,000 were in the third world. The growth, that's the third world there. This is the West line, which is growing but not as fast, and the Islamic heartland, which is really sort of stagnating. You see the same thing in terms of elected local spiritual assemblies, where, again, the third world accounted for 21,500 out of 24,700. And if you want to look at this in another way, here is a pair of pie graphs, which compare the distribution of Baha'i population to the distribution of the world population. So up here, the top graph, you can see, or if you look at the two, that Baha'is are underrepresented in Europe, somewhat overrepresented in Latin America, somewhat overrepresented in North America and Africa, and underrepresented in Asia, essentially because of China, which has not been very hospitable. But if you look at the larger developed, basically you've got 3/4, the same 3/4 you have here of Africa and Asia in the Baha'i community. So there are differences, but it's remarkably close. The picture you have here is some of the friends serving as volunteers at the Baha'i World Center, and you can see that ethnic diversity in the beautiful faces in that picture. By the way, the figures from in the pie charts came from a statistical study in the Britannica yearbook, which was by continent, and that's where that comes from. So the again the and I want to finish up here. Something to say. So at the end of that period, the Baha'i population represented a critical mass of approximately 1 per 1,000 in the world's population, and figures not too far from that in many countries. I think there probably are some places where there aren't Baha'is. I'm not sure. There used to be somebody in North Korea, and I'm not sure that there still is. The Vatican, of course, is not, if it's a country, not something that where there'd be Baha'is there. But basically, any country in the world and just about any territory, dependent territory or colony or whatever, you'll find Baha'is there. And as I said, 1 per 1,000. It's already a critical mass, and really a representation of the world's cultures and ethnic groups, which is really exemplary. But I want to just look at, lest anybody think that was a smooth and linear process. I just want to mention some of the major setbacks that were encountered along the way. I mentioned earlier about the house of worship in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, and how that whole community was just leveled and demolished. Many of the Baha'is were sent to Siberia, to gulags, and others were chased back across the border into Iran. The Nazi regime in Germany arrested Baha'is and confiscated literature and banned the operation. Egypt, which was a very long-standing community since the time of Baha'u'lláh with quite large numbers, was banned by Gamal Abdel Nasser in a decree in 1960, which is still in effect. Uganda was one of the largest communities in Africa and suffered considerably under Idi Amin. Vietnam, I remember in 1968 meeting a wonderful delegation of believers from Vietnam, but they were also driven underground during the war there, and have only just in the recent years been able to reestablish their community. And of course, that's not even mentioning the successive waves of persecution in the homeland of the Baha'i Faith in Iran, and I've just mentioned a few dates here, 1938, 1955, 1979, but that community has never been free to develop in a harmonious way, or in a normal way, or even to respond to all the attacks. So, and I'm sorry. I just want also to mention these are individual national communities that suffered, and as I mentioned before, that it's worth recalling that we are looking at an overall period marked by colonization, decolonization, 2 devastating world wars, the Great Depression, innumerable regional conflicts, deep social divisions, and major shifts in political alignments. And naturally, we have to also mention that there have been growing pains and many internal problems within the community. Some of them are challenges related to breaking new ground. There really never has been a religion before that didn't have some form of clergy. And so creating a community that's going to be coherent and essentially self-governing and decentralized without clergy has its own challenges, but that's I think a subject for another occasion. Considering all these obstacles and setbacks, the worldwide spread of the Baha'i Faith in 150 years appears as nothing less than miraculous. So I just want to conclude with a little look at where we are now. The Baha'i Faith, in terms of its geographic spread, is second only to Christianity, not of course in numbers, but in terms of the geographic spread, the number of countries and territories within which there are significant communities. It's firmly implanted in the grassroots in the different cultures. It's not something from overseas, something foreign. It's a genuine part of the culture and the country wherever it is, and it is united, dynamic, and this is the convention in 2018 to elect the international governing body with representations of about 160 different countries. And also the Baha'i community has real representation of the younger generation with a lot of energy and from all over the world. And essentially, what we're looking at is we've been talking about a period up through the mid-1990s. And essentially, the way I understand it is that we at that point had reached a certain level and as a monumental achievement to get there. But moving on to the next stage required a shifting of gears and somewhat of a new paradigm. And so it's starting in 1995 that the international governing body, the Universal House of Justice, set the world community on a new course focused on the building of vibrant communities, influencing culture in the surrounding society, and promoting a movement of populations toward Baha'u'llah's vision for a peaceful and united world. So that concludes my presentation. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, and I hope you'll feel free to fire away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I have a few questions already, and those of you who are thinking about your questions, please go ahead and type them out as well. Our first question is from Brazil. Could you please explain what do you attribute the fact that in Latin America as well as in Africa, people were more receptive to the faith, as your graph showed that the Baha'i representation there compared to other places in the world was much higher?
Well, one of the points I was hoping to make actually was that in terms of the numbers, that it actually just reflecting the way the population is. What was extraordinary, I think, is the relative rapidity with which that was achieved, and it's hard to give a particular explanation for that. I guess that, I mean, my own personal experience is in the continent of Africa, so perhaps the person who asked that question would want to think themselves about Brazil. But I think it had, in my experience, it had a lot to do with the fact that the Baha'i Faith arrived in a way in which it was still purely religious and not colonial. There in West and Central Africa, where I was, there were sort of three. There were along the the equatorial band. There was a band of people who had become Christians essentially because of the colonial forces arriving from the ocean. There was from the north. There was a whole stretch of people who had become Muslims through essentially the movement across the Sahara Desert. And in the middle were some people who had kept their African traditional religions because they didn't want either one. So the idea that a religion came that, first of all, said these disputes between religions are beside the point. They're all coming from the same source. This is just human interpretations and things, and that let's get back to the simplicity. The things that unite us are more important than the things that divide us, and you're free to be an African and to espouse this in your culture. That just made it much simpler. But that's really just my own experience. I don't have a more global answer.
Thank you. Here's another question for you. When did the faith move to the Soviet Union?
When did it enter? Okay. I mean, initially through this community in Ashgabat and that area of Baku and so sort of central Russia, and then with actually initially the Bolshevik revolution, the community was still existing and still basically prospering, but the Stalin regime was very anti-religion, anti-diversity, and I think perhaps felt a little threatened by some of the very progressive views of the Baha'i Faith, and essentially stamped it out, and it was underground, and basically until 1991, with the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Thank you. The next question is about some of the pie charts that you showed. I'm not sure if you would like to pull them back up. One of them, the question is, in the two pie charts, what were the dates corresponding to each one?
Okay. Right. I don't think we need to pull them up if it's just about the dates. That is the information that was published. Those pie charts are based on information published in the Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook. I'm trying to remember what year that came out, but it was in the 1990s.
We can give further information later on if you have the dates for that. That would be great.
No, I have it. I just don't have it in my memory.
No problem at all. The next question is, do we have an idea of the worldwide population of the Baha'i Faith, as we hear different numbers all the time?
Meaning as of now? As of now. Yeah. Well, you hear different numbers because there's been a shift in what we count and how we count it. And there are some very real difficulties in doing a complete account. So I can't put out a number, but I can explain some of the issues. And during the period that I've been talking about, the Baha'i community was defined by card-carrying, enrolled Baha'is who had voting rights and all that sort of thing. And it was a very sort of clear distinction of who was and who wasn't. Even then, the figures are not all totally reliable because some people withdraw or resign or whatever and don't tell anybody, and then that's not reflected in the numbers. But they're still, in grosso modo, real numbers. But most other religions actually count their membership by the people who are involved in their activities, and not necessarily, they don't have to vote, so that isn't an issue. And so some of the people who do the religious demographics, and who, in fact, I know the gentleman who prepared the figures that were in the Britannica article that I mentioned earlier, and his estimate of Baha'is is in the sort of 7 to 9 million range at the moment. Now, he's probably thinking more in terms of people who are involved in activities, but one of the big problems is that there are a number of countries with relatively large numbers of Baha'is where there is no membership roles. One of those is China, and one of them is Iran. And nobody really knows how many Baha'is there are in those places. So that's really what I can say on that question.
Okay, thank you. Another question about your presentation, and then I would like to move on to some other types of questions, if you don't mind. The other question about your presentation is, could you give some details about the setbacks in Uganda in 1971? So covering some of the growth in Africa and Uganda in particular.
Well, if there's anybody here from Uganda, they could undoubtedly give a better account. What I know is from visiting Uganda in the early 1990s, where the effect of an autocratic regime where many people were killed and many more were intimidated had a terrifically chilling effect on what was one of the most dynamic communities, Baha'i communities in Africa. It is the country where the the first continental house of worship for Africa was built in Kampala. But the country went through, even after Amin was overthrown, a long period of instability. When I was there, they were still shooting in the streets at night, and it was difficult. So the sum effect is that the momentum was really sort of broken. It's been picked up again, and the community is alive and well. But I think my understanding anyway is that you still feel some of the effects of that period.
Thank you. So moving on to questions that are a little bit different. Here's one. How should the Baha'is respond to the call of the House of Justice? How should we respond to the call to social action? And if you have any suggestions for individuals.
Well, I think that's probably really better addressed to the institutions in the particular areas where people live, because the shape of social action will look different in different countries and different situations, depending on the strength of the community, depending on the needs of the society in general. What I could say in a general sense is that the paradigm we're working under now puts a great deal of emphasis on working from the grassroots upward. We believe, and the House of Justice has told us again and again, that social change is not a top-down arrangement. It's something that happens starting in local communities and activities and educational activities, particularly leading to change and sometimes very significant change in local culture and in the culture, and then spreading from there. So social action fits within that context of local action, of action which is essentially based and undertaken by the people concerned. It's not something that's flown in or parachuted or funded from elsewhere, essentially. Sometimes a little assistance, but basically it's grassroots, moving upwards and outwards and responding to immediate needs in the community based on the resources available to them. So I think beyond that the friends should refer to their own counselors and board members and assemblies.
Thank you so much. So the next question is about your role as Secretary General when you were working in the Baha'i World Center. Could you give us some stories highlights or memories that stand out for you that you can share with us. And of course, with keeping the interest of our friends who are online with us today, if you could share something would be wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know that actually, I'm going to give another talk about the Baha'i World Center in I guess it's next month, and I'll save some of that for them. But the Middle East is a very interesting place, and a place that's been full of turmoil and conflict for over 100 years, and where some of the, the divisions are just as deep as they are in other places. We have our race issue, which is very much in the fore in the United States now, but the relationships within the different peoples of the Middle East are no less complicated, although it's a different history. But one of the things that I remember with real pleasure is that, while the Baha'i Faith is not taught in Israel and there is no Baha'i community, we tried to model the Baha'i message of peace through action. And one of the ways of doing that was to organize gatherings and inviting Jews and Arabs and people from every different walk of life and different professional area. And we had annual receptions on the occasion of the Baha'i New Year, which were attended by dignitaries of other religions and university people and government people and distinguished Arab representatives of their population and so on. And I remember on one occasion, a high-level government official came to this reception, and in the reception line, the welcome line, said, "Well, I brought along my daughter because I want her to see what our country could be like." In other words, this was the only place where she could actually come and see everyone getting along together and enjoying each other's company, and with optimism and hope. And that was not a unique thing. We had heard this on different occasions. And another thing that I remember very vividly, we had an open day on the terraces in Haifa, and it was advertised. It was on the occasion, I think it was the 10th anniversary of the opening of the terraced gardens, and it was advertised in the Arab press as well as the Hebrew press. And we had, in the space of 4 hours, I think it was a little short of 10,000 people visiting the gardens. And it was a most extraordinary mixture of ultra-Orthodox Jews and secular Jews and Arabs from the villages of the Galilee, and some from the city of Haifa, and people all over. And in the Baha'i Faith, we say that the unity, the diversity, the symbol we use is flowers in the garden. Well, that day we had a human garden inside the regular garden, because everybody was there. I mean, every kind of population, every sort of dress and headdress, and people brought their children, and everybody was smiling and and happy. It was just an unusual thing in a setting which is backed by tension and stress and difficulties most of the time.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely picture you drew for us. I have a couple of more questions. I'd like to just apologize in advance if there are some questions I don't get to. It's because we do have a limited time, and so if you've asked something that I haven't touched on, please excuse me. One of the questions here refers to one of the teachers you mentioned, Martha Root. Could you tell us if we know how long she traveled and how many countries she was able to open to the Baha'i Faith? And do you also know how she managed to meet the Queen Mary?
Well, I don't have all that in my memory, but there is a biography of Martha Root and another story about Queen Mary of Romania, and the stories. I mean, both of them are just fascinating. I really recommend the reading. I can see it from my bookcase, but I can't quite read the name of the author. But I would really recommend reading one or both of those books to get a full answer, and much more than even if I remembered it all, I wouldn't be able to give that kind of depth of detail and the rich story, because it's quite wonderful.
I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to test you.
Oh, that's okay. I don't mind admitting what I don't know or can't remember.
No problem, but sorry about that. And I have another question here. Given the difference of ages and technology between the time of Christianity and the Baha'i Faith, what is your perception about similarities and differences between the two, the growth of the two religions?
Well, I've touched on that. Of course, I mean, on some of the cultural consequences, and of course, I mean, it took Christianity roughly 1,700 years to reach Africa, where it took just about 100 years, or I mean, some of the countries in Africa were already in 1921, so that was only 80 years, but 80 to 100 years to reach in the time of the Baha'i Faith. Now, of course, the world is a very different place, and we have those. The map I showed of the steamship routes was also to illustrate that these things do matter and do help and create these connections. But the real importance of the difference, I mean, the technology is there, and it's for what it's worth, and the communications and the ability we have to meet together on teleconferencing with I don't know how many continents we have, but quite a few this evening is a good illustration. But again, I think that the really significant difference has to do with this effect of culture. When Christianity arrived in Africa or South America, it was a European religion, and it was almost more European than Christian. When Islam, as it spread around the world, it spreads with a lot of, it's attached to the Arabic language, it's attached to Arab culture, and yes, there are variations, but still, this changes the picture, because you can't distinguish really the national cultural influence from, or let's say it's very difficult to distinguish the religious content from the national, cultural, political baggage that comes with it.
Wonderful, thank you. I have one more question here. You mentioned that Abdu'l-Baha was freed in 1908, and he had a 6-year window until the beginning. 6-year window, until the beginning of the First World War. Could you touch on some of the things or some of the ways that he took advantage of that window of opportunity and how the faith spread at that time?
Well, the main thing was actually these travels that he undertook to Egypt and Europe and North America, and it was really quite extraordinary in those days. I mean, he was already in his 70s, which was, given the life of exile and prison and so on, it was already quite difficult. And at that time, he could travel by steamship. There were no airliners. Somebody offered him a ticket on the Titanic, which he declined and chose a smaller boat, which was a good choice under the circumstances. But I mean, he did visit in that time. Again, I don't know the exact number. I would guess probably 5 or 6 European countries. He spent a long period or several long periods in France and in Paris. He spent almost a year in North America, traveling right across the continent. I mean, most of the time was in New York and Boston and Montreal, sort of on the eastern coast. We also visited Chicago and both San Francisco and Los Angeles area, riding on trains and horse and buggy and and all that, and it was a remarkable achievement. And before that, the Baha'is in this part of the world were, quite. How should I say? They had very limited documentation or about the Baha'i Faith. There are a lot of things they misunderstood. They weren't sure whether Abdul Baha was the return of Christ or somebody else. And this clarification and consolidation was absolutely essential. Now, the other thing that he did that was also very important, he'd started it even as he was still a prisoner, but was to complete the transfer of the remains of the Báb from Iran and to build an initial structure to house those remains on the slope of Mount Carmel and to deposit them there. And he didn't feel free to leave on his travels until that had been completed.
Thank you. I have one more question here, and friends, this will be the last question. So if anyone wants to squeeze something in, please let me know. Here it is. Would you say that the main reason the faith has been growing at this pace is because it is based in a form of non-professional missionaries, the pioneers?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. That is certainly a characteristic which is important. But to say, I mean, if you look at the investment of material and human resources in Christian missionary activities, it's huge and vastly dwarfs the rather feeble efforts of sending a few people here and a few people here and a family there and so on. Now, it's really a little too much like comparing apples and oranges. The way the Baha'i Faith has spread is unique, and it's produced its results. But to say that, to compare that with some other religion at a different time and a different period and different circumstances doesn't really make sense. I think that I mentioned that that one of the challenges here is a religion that does not have clergy or missionaries, where every member of the Baha'i Faith is really on the same level of equality and building, and where the community essentially functions from the bottom up and in a measure of democracy that no other religion has really attempted. I mean, I guess the Quakers would be the nearest example, but they're far from a worldwide multicultural spread that the Baha'i Faith has achieved.
Okay, well, we've got one more question here. What countries in Africa have you lived in?
Visited?
Lived in.
Lived in. Okay, that's easy. Central African Republic, Cameroon, and Ivory Coast.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay.
I will be opening up the mic for everyone to applause and thank you at the very end. I just wanted to make some announcements before we finish up here. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for your questions. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Lincoln for your wonderful presentation. First, for everyone to know, and I've been asked several times during the presentation, the fireside has a site for safekeeping of all of these videos. The site is called firesidebaha'i.org. So www.firesidebaha'i.org. And this fireside will not be uploaded immediately, but the previous ones are there. And as soon as this one is ready as well, it will be uploaded to that site. You can use it for personal use or for any other fireside that you would like to present. So the first announcement is that we are very lucky to have Dr. Lincoln present for us in August and September. So August 16th at 8 o'clock, we will be having him again. Why is the Baha'i World Center in Israel is the subject. On September 13th at 8 o'clock again, what are Baha'is actually doing to make the world a better place is the subject. Both of these will be on the site as well. So you can look at the site to put all of these events on your calendar. The two upcoming firesides are in French for our French-speaking friends here. The next one is on July 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Mahmoud Samandari. And the one after that, our dear Counselor Joan Lincoln will be speaking also in French on August 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as well. And the subject that she will be covering is very much related to the last question that we had about the spread of the Baha'i Faith through the work of the pioneers. So we are very fortunate to have all of those with us. If I can find the button to unmute everyone. Everyone's applause. Thank you very much for your...
So much.
Thank you.
Very well done. Very beautiful. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you. Nice seeing you. Allah Hafiz.
A lot of people that we know a long time ago.
Allah.
Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.
You drew a beautiful picture, Dr. Lincoln. You drew a beautiful picture from the inception of faith in Iran and the state of its progress up to now. I really enjoyed.
Thank you so much, everyone.